Please be seated.
Royal Commission on Antisemitism and Social Cohesion is now in session.
Commissioner, the witness this morning is Dr. Dave Rich, who is presently in London and joins us by ABL.
Yes, and might I thank you very much, Dr. Rich, for making yourself available at what is an uncivilised late hour for you and an early one for us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I think we're sharing the pain in that respect.
Indeed. Mr. Lancaster, perhaps just before you commence your examination, I might just turn to Ms. Dwyer, just to indicate, Ms. Dwyer, thank you for your the preparation of your application for leave to examine, and you may take it that you have leave to examine on the topics that you have identified in that application.
Thank you, Commissioner.
And Mr. Sheehan, naturally, you have leave in relation to those topics, and if there is some further matter, by all means, if you if you so indicate.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Lancaster.
Will you be making an oath or an affirmation?
An affirmation.
Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please say I do.
I do.
Dr. Rich, what is your full name, please?
Dr. Dave Rich.
What is your occupation?
I'm Director of Policy at the Community Security Trust.
You've prepared an expert report dated the 4th of May 2026. Are the contents of that expert report true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief, and the opinions expressed are opinions you hold?
That's correct.
Commissioner, the document ID is stat.899.000.0013_R, and I tender the expert report.
Yes, that will be received as Exhibit 1.130.
Dr. Rich, you've included your CV in your statement. I won't go through it all, but could you please just give a brief indication of your academic qualifications? You have a bachelor's degree from?
I have a bachelor's degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science in Government and History. I have a PhD from Birkbeck College, London, or Birkbeck University of London, sorry, on Zionist and anti-Zionist political protest and student activism in Britain from 1968 to 1986. I've written 2 books about anti-Semitism and several academic book chapters.
Yes. You're a research fellow at the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism?
That's correct, yes.
And one of the books that you've referred to, that you've authored, is titled Everyday Hate, How Anti-Semitism is Built into Our World and How You Can Change It, first published in 2023, I think.
That's right, yes.
Your expert report sets out your opinion on 6 questions that you've been asked that are generally directed to understanding what anti-Semitism is and how it is manifested in contemporary society. What I propose to do, Dr. Rich, is to take you through to address some aspects of your written statement in answer to each of those questions. The first topic that you were asked to address was what is anti-Semitism and how is it similar to or different from other prejudices. So perhaps just the general question first, how do you describe anti-Semitism?
It's a big question. Anti-Semitism is prejudice, discrimination, hostility or hatred towards Jewish people, Jewish organisations, Jewish institutions, or people or entities perceived to be Jewish. It can manifest in both violent and non-violent ways, but broadly speaking, it's built on a set of negative stereotypes, attitudes, and tropes about Jews.
You refer in your statement to the first deployment of the term in 1879, and you refer to the fact that Hebrew is described as one of the Semitic group of languages. which happens also to include Arabic. Is that right?
That's correct, yes. Obviously, anti-Jewish prejudice and discrimination goes back much further in history than 1879.
Yes.
But the word anti-Semitism was invented and popularised in that period by an anti-Jewish political activist. He wanted to give his anti-Jewish politics a kind of modern, scientific, rational-sounding label, and this was a period where everybody thought and spoke in racialised terms. So he landed on the word anti-Semitism because Hebrew is the ancient Jewish language of prayer. It's part of a group of languages known as Semitic languages. So from that, he came up with the idea that the Jews are the Semitic race, which was a complete invention, as you know, many racial categories are basically inventions in different ways. And from that, he came up with the word that anti-Jewish politics is anti-Semitism. So the word from its origins meant policies and practices and discourse against Jews specifically.
In this early section of your report, you refer to anti-Jewish prejudice in early Christianity and then through the Middle Ages, and the fact that many of the prejudicial stereotypes and tropes from that historical era deployed against Jews then have persisted over time. Could you briefly explain the particular stereotypes or tropes in that category?
That's correct. If you're looking at the history of the anti-Semitism that we are familiar with today, the starting point really is the idea that developed in the kind of 2nd, 3rd centuries that the Jews were responsible for the crucifixion, that they demanded that the Roman authorities in Judea crucified Jesus Christ. There was anti-Jewish practices and ideas further back in antiquity, but this is our starting point really. And from that developed the idea that Jews were the antithesis of all that is holy, all that is good, all that is moral, and that by not just rejecting Christ's message, but having him killed, they had a satanic, a demonic quality. Now these really took form in the sort of 11th, 12th, 13th centuries in the Middle Ages for various reasons to do with what was happening in European societies at that time. That's where you start to get some of the more familiar tropes we know today. So perhaps the most common anti-Semitic trope is the association of Jews with money, the idea that Jews are greedy, that they are stingy, that they are unnaturally wealthy. And this traces back to the Middle Ages when Jews were kind of funneled into the practice of money lending and became associated with money lending in European societies in the Middle Ages. So that association of Jews and money grew, but it was a very negative association.
Can I just stop you there?
Money lenders are unpopular, basically.
Dr. Rich?
You had the idea of the
Dr.
blood
Rich, could I
libel.
just stop you there for a moment?
Sure.
Could I take you back to the first stereotype you mentioned, which you describe in your report as the deicide stereotype or trope, and you refer to the persistence of that through medieval Europe. You make a significant point on my reading of your report in paragraph 2.7.1, where you refer to something that happened in 1965. Could you explain what occurred then?
So in 1965, the Catholic Church made an absolutely historic announcement in a statement from the Holy See called Nostra Aetate, which declared that the Jews should not be held permanently responsible for Jesus' death. And this related to a reading of the original Gospels, in which, in the Gospel of Matthew, the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate, who crucified Jesus, was quoted as saying to the Jewish crowd who apparently wanted Jesus crucified, that I'm innocent of this man's blood. And according to this gospel, the Jews replied, his blood is on us and on our children. And that idea perpetuated throughout history, the guilt, the responsibility for the crucifixion lay not just with the Jews who were there in ancient Judea in AD 33 or thereabouts, but through successive generations of Jews through eternity. And then in 1965, so this was an absolutely, I mean, as dramatic a ruling as you could get in terms of Christian-Jewish relations, a different reading of this history and of this theology that declared in very clear terms from the Holy See that Jews were not permanently responsible, and that anti-Semitism was something to be condemned, was against Christian traditions, and it was really a watershed in Jewish-Catholic relations.
One thing it did, though, perhaps indicate was that for some 1,000 years, up to 1965, that had been a stereotype or a trope that had not been formally disavowed by organised religion.
Well, that's correct. And this idea of Jews as Christ killers is something that perpetuated right up to the 20th century. I mean, certainly in my parents' grandparents' generation, it would be a very common insult in school playgrounds or on the streets. And of course, the fact that the Catholic Church had to make this declaration in 1965 meant it was still alive. And I think this is part of a kind of re-evaluation of relations with Jews and a recognition of the deep, enduring nature of anti-Semitism after the Holocaust.
Then if I can return to the observations you were making about the historical association of Jews with money as a common anti-Semitic stereotype. You explain the source of that in historical terms. Could you explain how that came about?
So in the Middle Ages, it was against Christian teaching to lend money at interest, which was known as usury at the time. It was seen as sinful to do so. And at the same time, Jews living in medieval Europe were banned from various professions. They were very restricted in which trades they could do, whether they could own land or if they could employ Christians and so on. And again, some of this came directly from the highest authority. So in 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council of the Catholic Church issued a ruling that Jews could not hold public office, that Jews had to wear special badges on their clothing to identify them as Jewish in public. I mean, we think that started with Nazi Germany and the Yellow Stars, but it didn't. It goes back a lot further. So all these things combined, the prohibition on Christian money lending and the fact that Jews were prohibited from other trades, meant a lot of Jews were kind of funneled into money lending. Now, most money lenders in Europe, nonetheless, were not Jewish, and most Jews were not money lenders. But still, this association grew because some of the best known, most influential, most important money lenders in Western Europe at that time were Jewish. And they also tended to be the leading figures in the Jewish communities there. So this association grew, and that then has continued throughout history, through various different periods of history and various different iterations.
The next category of stereotypes and tropes that you address in your report is the blood libel myth, which you describe as one of the strangest yet most important of all anti-Jewish myths. Could you explain what the blood libel myth is, please?
This is the idea that the allegation that Jews kidnap and murder non-Jewish children as part of a religious ritual, and that they consume their blood or they use their flesh as part of that for religious or medicinal purposes. It originated in England in 1144, and then it spread throughout medieval Europe. And normally what would happen is a young child would go missing or would be found dead. It would be a terrible tragedy in whichever town or village it happened, and the local Jewish community would be blamed. And a myth would develop these happened especially around Easter time, because the myth was that the Jews were reenacting the crucifixion, because of course it was believed they had killed Christ, by crucifying Christian children, that they would drain them of their blood, and they would use their blood, either drink it neat, because Jewish blood was considered to be deficient, or they would use their blood to make matzah, which is the unleavened bread that Jewish people use at Passover, which of course coincides with Easter. It's entirely false. I always have to say that when I describe this, because it's so bizarre. But it was widely believed. And some of these cases became very famous and led to the boys in question, or the children in question who'd been killed or found dead, becoming kind of unofficial saints. It was never mainstream Christian teaching, and various popes at different times issued statements against it. But it was still very popular as a kind of folkloric, anti-Jewish myth that really took hold in medieval Europe.
The myth of Jewish child murder is ancient, and you refer to it persisting into the Nazi era, and I think you consider that there are at least echoes of this myth in contemporary discourse from time to time.
There are, I mean, this was not only, as you say, in the Middle Ages. There were many blood libel or ritual murder allegations in 19th and 20th century Europe, both before and after the Holocaust. It was a central part of Nazi propaganda. There are blood libel stories in mainstream culture as well. I mean, in the Canterbury Tales, The Merchant of Venice kind of has echoes of it. But in the modern day, this idea that Jews are particularly driven to murder children, and that child murder is a particularly Jewish crime, and that Jews therefore are unfathomably inhuman and cruel in their behaviour. This all comes from the blood libel idea. And it is an idea that has very deep roots in our culture and a very deep resonance, and you can see its traces in some of the depictions of Israel today, in the idea that Israel goes out of its way to deliberately kill Palestinian children, that those children are not just victims of war, but are targets of this Jewish desire to murder children. You see it in some of the stories, some of the false allegations that the Israeli army systematically harvests the organs of Palestinian victims in Gaza to use for medicinal purposes. There's that echo. You see lots of cartoons and placards of Israeli politicians supposedly drinking children's blood. It recurs over and over again.
The next category of stereotype that you address is the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which you refer to as the most significant and influential work of modern anti-Semitism. Could you describe this fabricated text, when it came into existence, and how it's been deployed?
So this is a text that alleges there is a global Jewish conspiracy, or global Zionist conspiracy, because it's called the Elders of Zion, but the book is all about Jews, to basically subvert and then take over all governments and societies all around the world, and that to do this, Jews will try and control the economy, the media, governments. They'll debase culture. They use war and revolution, all different methods. It's a ridiculous book, but it was incredibly popular in the first half of the 20th century. It was published in around 1903 or so by Russian secret police, Russian intelligence agents who fabricated the book. They plagiarized it from a 19th century French political satire that had nothing to do with Jews at all. And it circulated around Russia under the Tsar, and then it really made its breakthrough into European mainstream in around 1920, when it was translated into several different European languages. And it was widely believed. Newspapers across Europe, including the Times and others, believed that it was true, although the Times was the first to debunk it and prove it was a fraud. It was believed by leading politicians, by monarchs, by generals, high society and mass media. By one, it became kind of a compulsory text in German schools in Nazi Germany. By one estimate, one historical account of its development estimated that it was between 1920 and 1940 or so, it was the second most popular book in the world after the Bible. So it had real mainstream purchase, and at its heart was this idea, which is at the heart really of all anti-Semitism, which is the conspiracy theory element. And, question one was put to me, what are the similarities and differences between anti-Semitism and other types of prejudice? This is one of the real singular characteristics of anti-Semitism, is that it's not just, or not only, a kind of base racial prejudice against people who are different. It's a conspiracy theory that claims Jews are to blame for everything. Whatever it is going on in the world, whatever it is you're unhappy about in your life, there's always a Jew somewhere, or some Jews, or some Jewish entity that is pulling the strings behind the scenes and doing harm to you or to society or to the whole of humanity. And the Protocols, the Elders of Zion, is the book that brought all of that together and gave that idea to the world.
The next category that you address is the dual loyalty trope, which you describe in your report as the allegation that Jews are an alien presence in society and will always place loyalty to other Jews or to Israel above loyalty to the country of their birth. How prevalent has that trope been over time?
So this idea is very common. The idea that Jews stick together, they're only loyal to themselves, or since Israel has been in existence, they're primarily loyal to Israel. And they can never truly, a British Jew can never truly be British. An Australian Jew can never truly be Australian. They'll always be Jewish first. Now, it's a racialized trope in that respect, because it ties into this racist idea that immigrants can never integrate. They can never take on the nationality of the country where they're born. Even if their parents, their grandparents were born in that country, they're never truly of that nationality. So anti-Semitism can manifest in different ways. This is one way in which it very much manifests as a form of racism. And it has been very common over the years. In my report, the example I cite as probably the most famous in history is the Dreyfus Affair, where a French Jewish army officer, Alfred Dreyfus, was wrongly accused of spying for Germany. And he was convicted, but it was very quickly realized that he was innocent, but it was covered up. And it became a dividing line that absolutely broke French society and French politics apart at the end of the 19th and early 20th century over some of the most important issues in French society at the time, but all hinged on this core idea of, can a Jew ever be loyal to France or to any other country? But we also see it today with all sorts of allegations about Israel lobbies and so on, that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the country of their birth or even of their parents' birth.
Can I next ask you to address the last category that you have identified in your statement, which is a more modern form of anti-Semitic trope coming together, you say, in the notion that Jews are modern-day Nazis. You've referred in your statement to a passage from a decision of Mr. Justice Chamberlain in England in 2025, where His Honour said, depending on the context, a criticism of Israel which pointedly uses Nazi language and imagery as a racialised taunt of this kind could reasonably be regarded as anti-Semitic. Could you address this as a trope, as a stereotype, the process of comparison with the Nazis?
Sure. This is an example of how anti-Semitism changes over time and it adapts to changing circumstances. And that's changing circumstances relating to the status of Jewish people and of the Jewish people, but also changing circumstances in politics and society and history. So this trope, the idea that Jews are modern-day Nazis, obviously could not have existed before the 1930s. It's a modern trope, and it is an example of how anti-Semitic ideas have adapted to a world that is after the Holocaust, where the Holocaust happened, and a world in which Israel exists. And those two things have changed the context in which anti-Semitism happens. Now, the comparison, the idea that Jews are modern-day Nazis, that Israel is replicating the crimes of Nazi Germany, is not a modern thing. It's not something that's only happened in the last couple of years. This is something that was present in especially Soviet propaganda, but also in kind of Arab anti-Zionist propaganda, really from very early on after the Holocaust. And it is this idea that the Jews are basically mimicking the behavior of their worst persecutors. Now, why is this anti-Semitic? Look, people compare things to Nazism all the time. It's our highest, our most extreme marker of evil in the modern world, and for understandable and correct reasons. But the idea, the allegation that Israel, a state founded 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, the country that has the highest number of Holocaust survivors living in it of any country on earth, is basically not a response to anti-Semitism or an example of Jewish survival after the Holocaust, but is actually a replication of the very evil that caused the Holocaust. It takes that Jewish pain and it turns it against Jews. So it takes the fact that Jews were the primary victims of the Nazis and the victims of the Holocaust. It takes the fact that Israel is a Jewish state, and it uses that Jewish connection as its line of attack in order to play on and provoke Jewish sensitivities, and these are the most painful Jewish sensitivities of all. It also has a deeper meaning, because the subliminal message of comparing Israel to Nazi Germany and saying Jews today are behaving like Nazis is also to say, we don't have to worry, we don't have to care about the Holocaust anymore. We, the rest of the world, you don't need to feel guilty about it, we don't need to pay attention to it, because you're just as bad as the Nazis, so stop going on about it. That's the subliminal message of the comparison. So it's hurtful and harmful to Jews, it's historically incorrect to the point of completely distorting the history of the Holocaust, so it can play as a form of Holocaust denial as well, or Holocaust revisionism at least. But it also undermines the core values of society to the extent that so much of the post-war international order is built on learning the lessons from the Holocaust. And yet this comparison undermines that.
In your answer, you referred to the capacity or the evidence of anti-Semitism to change over time. I mean, in paragraph 2.9, you refer to anti-Semitism as malleable. Deborah Lipstadt has, I think, described it as having an elastic quality or a shape-shifting ability. Rabbi Sachs has referred to it as a virus which can mutate and does mutate in different environments over time. This common explanation of anti-Semitism in commentators seems to be generally accepted. How would you yourself explain this flexibility, this malleability?
That's correct, and I think all those different metaphors, they all settle on the same idea. And this is a reflection of what you discover if you study anti-Jewish prejudice, anti-Jewish discourse throughout different periods of history, is that you tend to get the same core idea that Jews are conspiratorial, that they are demonic, that they are the antithesis of all that is good and wholesome, that they stand in the path between humanity and a better future, that they conspire together to do harm to others. These core ideas get expressed and articulated in the language of the time. So in the Middle Ages, they were articulated through religious discourse. Anti-Semitism was very much a religious prejudice. It was about Jews being the enemy of Christ, because medieval Europe was a religious society. In the more modern period, after kind of secularization of Europe, you had anti-Semitism expressed through the language of universalism. You know, in the 18th century and 19th century, as Europe kind of liberalized, the allegation became that Jews were too particular, they were too clannish, they were too insular. They couldn't adapt to universal values. So universalism and liberalism became the language through which Jews were attacked, but on the same means. In the kind of 19th and early 20th centuries, the racial politics of the time, you had the same ideas articulated through racialized language about Jews. But the core ideas, the core tropes underneath the language, you have to look behind the language, through the language, at the kind of architecture of thought, that was the same. And today, in the modern day, we live in a secular world where human rights and racism are the kind of moral framework for our societies. And I think it's not a coincidence that Israel, the Jewish state, is held up as the archetype of a human rights abuser, the archetype of racial supremacy and colonialism and genocide, and all these things that are today's equivalent of all those previous iterations. And the idea that Israel and Zionism stand between humanity and a more peaceful world, a better future, is a very clear replication, a re-articulation in modern terms of that very old idea about the Jews.
One of the later questions that I'll ask you about it addresses Zionism and anti-Zionism and its connection to anti-Semitism. So I'll return to that topic, Dr. Rich. But for the moment, could I ask you some questions about the second question that you've been asked to address in your report, which is whether, in your opinion, governmental responses to anti-Semitism should be based on the application of a particular definition of anti-Semitic conduct. Could you please just identify the value that you see, as you describe in your report, of a common definition? It may stand to reason.
Well, I think there's a very basic idea. If governments are going to develop policies and measures to tackle anti-Semitism, there has to be a common understanding of what anti-Semitism is.
Just hold on a minute,
And
Dr.
also-
Rich. I think your volume just diminished quite significantly. Is something?
Really?
Yeah.
Nothing's changed at my end.
That's better now. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
If governments are going to develop policies and measures to tackle anti-Semitism, the baseline, the starting point, has to be a common understanding of what anti-Semitism is. And also, because anti-Semitism does not always present in the most explicit, crude terms, it often presents through the kind of stereotypes, conspiracy theories and tropes that we've been discussing, which often use coded language. It's not always straightforward to identify and recognize anti-Semitism. So a definition, an agreed definition that identifies those other ways in which it can manifest and present, it seems obvious it has to be a start, that has to be there as a baseline. Otherwise, policies will either people won't know how to apply them because they won't know what to apply them to, or you'll have different agencies applying measures in different ways to different things because there's not a common definition. You'll be measuring things in different ways for the same reason. So it just seems I mean, it's almost a truism. You have to know what anti-Semitism is in order to develop policies against it.
Yes. And you've set out in your report a series of international institutions that you've identified as either endorsing or adopting or referring to the utility of having, firstly, a common definition, but secondly, the IRA definition, which I'll come to in a moment. But in doing so, you have, in your words, injected a note of caution. What is that?
There is an overall benefit to having a definition. That is very much the case. The note of caution is we shouldn't assume that if we can agree a definition that will solve all the problems and it will end every disagreement about what is or isn't anti-Semitic. Because anti-Semitism keeps changing, because sometimes it appears in less obvious forms, in more subtle ways, there will always be, as I put it in the report, there will always be edge cases where there is genuine good faith disagreement about what is anti-Semitic and what isn't. And that's partly why, I know we're going to get on to discussing the IHRA definition, that's partly why it's written in the way that it is to recognise that fact. And the experience of working with first the EUMC definition and then the IHRA definition, the experience of working with it is, it can be very, very helpful for identifying most cases of anti-Semitism, but it won't necessarily give you an answer to every single case. So it's not the solution. It won't solve everything, but it's very, very helpful.
Can I ask you to move now to that third question that you've addressed in your report, in which you were asked to explain the background to the IHRA working definition and its adoption by the Australian government. As part of your explanation of the background, you refer to what in your view was a change from about the early 2000s in the sources and drivers of anti-Semitic hate crimes. Is that a view you hold?
That's correct, yes.
Could you explain what that change was from what to what as a general proposition?
So this relates to what was happening in Europe and especially in Western Europe in the early 2000s, although I believe there were similar patterns happening in other countries around the world as well. But for the purpose of the emergence of the definition, Western Europe is really key. In September, October 2000, the Second Intifada began in Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. And it immediately triggered a significant noticeable increase in anti-Jewish hate crimes in a lot of countries around the world, and especially a lot of countries in Western Europe. It's a similar dynamic to what we've seen more recently, where events in the Middle East trigger anti-Semitism in Western countries. And Jewish communities across Europe were reporting a really significant increase in this anti-Semitism. So in the UK, October 2000, there was a fourfold increase in anti-Semitic incidents compared to October the previous year. The next few weeks saw over 250 violent anti-Semitic incidents against Jewish sites worldwide. This carried on. And as well as reporting a big increase in anti-Semitic incidents, both violent and non-violent, Jewish communities in these countries were also reporting that these incidents were being carried out by a different, more diverse range of offenders. So in the 1990s, there was quite a significant surge in far-right extremism, in neo-Nazism in Europe, in several different countries. Holocaust denial was becoming very prevalent. There were active, violent, far-right movements in lots of countries. And most anti-Semitism came from the far right in that period, in the 1990s. After 2000, what Jewish communities were reporting is that actually a lot of these anti-Semitic incidents were being carried out by Islamist extremists, by radicalized anti-Semitic elements from within local Arab and Muslim communities, or by people from the far left. I mean, there was still also anti-Semitism from the far right that hadn't disappeared, but these proportions had shifted, and in some countries shifted really dramatically. And that was the change, that it was that kind of lived experience reporting from Jewish communities that led eventually to the EUMC and then definition being developed.
What is the IRA? If you could just give a brief explanation. It's an intergovernmental body established, I think, in 1998. But what is its purpose?
That's correct. It's an intergovernmental body established to strengthen, advance, and promote Holocaust education, remembrance, and research worldwide. And they have a number of different working definitions, one of which is for anti-Semitism.
Your report sets out the range of international organisations and countries that have adopted or referred to the utility of the IRA definition. How would you describe that adoption across the globe?
It's pretty comprehensive. It's according to the IRA website, the definition has been adopted or endorsed by 46 different UN member states. It's been recommended by various other intergovernmental bodies, the United Nations, the European Union, the Organization of American States, the OSCE, etc., have expressed support for the definition. A lot of these are bodies that wouldn't formally adopt a definition, but they recognize the value in it. There are also lots of examples of non-governmental bodies adopting it. I mean, certainly from the arena I know best, which is in the UK, a large number of local authorities, local municipalities have adopted it. Around 240 higher education providers, so universities and colleges, have adopted it. It's even been adopted by football clubs. It's used by Ofcom, which is the main media regulator. And it's also endorsed by most kind of mainstream representative Jewish community organizations as well. So it's very widely adopted in that respect, adopted and used.
And what's the significance of its self-description as a working definition?
The whole idea behind the definition, and this was the idea of the people who wrote the original one back in 2005, is that it's not intended to be a criminal code. It's not intended to be adopted into criminal law. It has no legal status. It's a practical tool. That's what it was written for, that's what it was designed for, and that's what it should be used for, as a practical tool to help people who identify examples of anti-Semitism. Now that might be law enforcement, it might be judiciary, very often it's civil society, NGOs, regulators, universities, schools, companies, anyone who may come across examples of anti-Semitism and have to investigate it or deal with it. And it's intended for use in those kind of scenarios.
I might ask the operator to bring it up on the screen just so we can address some of the aspects of it, Dr. Rich. And when it comes up, Dr. Rich, I'll just begin with the formally adopted so-called non-legally binding working definition, which you may be able to see in the box, which I might ask to be zoomed, please. The bold text in the box in the middle of the page.
I can read it, it's fine.
Yes, good. So one of the observations you made a little earlier was that the core of anti-Semitism is the expression of hatred towards Jews. The terms of the definition refer immediately after that to rhetorical and physical manifestations, and you've certainly given some evidence about that. And also there's a reference to being directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals. I take it that's the category you referred to a little earlier also, where those persons who might be assumed or perceived to be Jews, whether they not or are in fact Jews, is not to the point, but the perception and the hatred directed towards Jews or perceived Jews is the scope of the definition.
That's correct. And this definition, it starts off talking about a perception of Jews, and then it says expresses as hatred towards Jews. So that's about the kind of stereotypes and tropes we've been discussing that then manifest as hostility or that support hostility, if you like. And they can then manifest in violent or non-violent ways through hate crimes, other incidents, terrorism, and so on, that can be directed against individuals, against property, against community institutions, against religious facilities, really against any entity identified as Jewish. But that identification can sometimes be a misidentification. But if the motivation, if the perception is that the target is Jewish and the motivation is anti-Semitic, then the fact that a particular hate crime offender has made a mistake doesn't really change the anti-Semitic nature of their act.
You explain in your report the way the definition has a repeated emphasis on conditionality of the definition, that is, express references to the significance of context in identifying anti-Semitic conduct. Could you explain that, please?
That's correct. So there are a number of cases in the definition where the definition uses conditional language. So, for example, we can see on the screen below the box in bold, it says to guide IHRA in its work, the following examples may, I'll stress may, serve as illustrations. And then it goes on to say manifestations might include targeting the state of Israel. So it's not definitive about these. It's saying it might do. And then later on it goes on to say contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, the workplace, and in the religious sphere could, taking into account the overall context, include, but are not limited to, and then it runs through a whole series of examples.
Yes,
and this is a very important aspect of the definition, is that it's not a binary speech code. It's not a tick box exercise, where if you can match up something in the definition to a particular phrase or word, then it's case closed, that's anti-Semitic. What it is it like a set of lights to guide you on your path as an investigator when you're looking into a particular complaint or a particular incident to work out if it is anti-Semitic or not. And it gives a lot of latitude, but also places a lot of responsibility on some person using the definition to exercise their own judgment within the bounds and the guidelines that the definition sets out, in order to assess every case on its merits. And I think that's a really important part in, anti-Semitism is a very serious allegation to level. And I think it's right and fair and accurate to judge every case on its merits.
And in its particular context.
And in its context, yes, absolutely.
You were referring, I think, to the first paragraph on the next page of the document, if the operator could perhaps flip it to that with the paragraph up the top. In other words,
that's right. It says you have to take into account the overall context. But now, to be fair, some of the examples here, it's very hard to think of a context in which it would not be anti-Semitic. So the first example that we can see calling for, aiding or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. I mean, it's very hard to think of a context where that would not be anti-Semitic. Others, I think it is more uncertain, and that different contexts will give different perspectives. But I think the fact that it sets that out at the start is, in a way, is the central element of the definition, is that demand for contextual analysis.
In your report, you've expressed the view that with hindsight it may have been more accurate to call this IRA publication a guide to anti-Semitism rather than a definition of anti-Semitism. Could you explain that?
I mean, it's a pedantic point. One of the main criticisms of the definition is that it's too long to really be a definition, and the definitions ought to be definitive, and that this is too conditional, it isn't definitive. Which is kind of true, but I think it's a criticism that really misses the point. Because the point is, it was written to be a practical guide. The fact that it's called a definition, whatever, that's its name, but actually look at what's in it, look at its usefulness, look at its utility and its practical value, rather than getting hung up on the fact that, someone in an EU committee 20 years ago chose the word definition for it. I think that's really kind of missing the wood for the trees.
Dr. Rich, one of the topics you were asked to address was just to identify some areas of controversy in respect of the definition, and one particular area that you've identified in your report is a situation in which critics of the IRA definition have presented an argument that it's imprecise and that it allows or encourages supporters of Israel to try to use the definition to close down legitimate criticisms of Israel. What is your view about that?
So, look, I think like any tool, it has to be used in the way that it was meant to be used and for the purpose for which it was designed. And if it's used wrongly, then I think the responsibility for that is on the people who misread it. There is a tendency of people on both sides of the argument, both some supporters of Israel and some supporters of Palestinians, to overinterpret some elements of the definition and oversimplify it and ignore the fact that the definition repeatedly and very deliberately uses this conditional language and insists on context. So I think the imprecision is its strength. I think that is its value. I don't really accept the idea that that just encourages people to apply it to things that it shouldn't be applied to, because I think if you stripped all the context out, then I think it would probably end up catching even more anti-Israel speech than it does. I think the context actually should be seen as a benefit. There are some independent observers, the former UN rapporteur on freedom of religion and belief, who endorsed its use, who argued that actually critics of Israel should welcome the IHRA definition because it provides a guide to how to avoid anti-Semitic speech in their campaigns and in their discourse and so on. So I think it's about how you approach it, but the idea that it encourages misuse, I don't buy that, no.
You've addressed some of the examples, in particular the examples that mention Jews and Israel within the terms of the examples. Can I just ask you about a couple of them, please? So perhaps if we could scroll down the page so that the fifth bullet point is visible. Thanks. So the fifth is the example accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. You express the view that's simply a version of the Holocaust denial trope. Example 6 you deal with in your report, but could I come to example 11, which is the final example, holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the State of Israel as an example of, depending on the context, conduct that may amount to anti-Semitism. Could you address the controversy about that and your view of the way that example works?
I mean, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the State of Israel essentially is the mentality that leads to, or is the justification provided by terrorists who murder Jews around the world, or hate crime offenders who attack Jews around the world while shouting slogans or abuse about Israel and about Gaza and so on. It's the idea that a random Jewish person in London or Sydney or New York or wherever can be treated as a local representation of the State of Israel. It's holding all Jews responsible for the actions of some Jews, which is the fundamental building block of racism. The idea of this kind of collective guilt that if you're unhappy with what one person from a particular background has done, you can attack a person of the same background who has nothing to do with it and hold them responsible for it. It's a fundamentally racist idea. And it's something that does happen a lot, and it's something that a lot of Jewish people report happening to them. So I think it's absolutely correct that this example is included in the definition.
You've drawn attention in this context to the fact that the IRA definition back on the first page expressly indicates that criticism of Israel similar to that levelled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. And you, I think, describe that, again, commentators have been at issue about the meaning and application of that sentence.
So some critics of the IRA definition just ignore that sentence completely and will say and write that the IRA definition brands any criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. I've seen that said and written by people who really ought to know better more times than I can count. And it is obviously not true. I mean, it just ignores that line completely. But then the other criticism of that is made by a couple of the more thoughtful critics is the argument that Israel is not like any other country. Israel is utterly unique. Therefore, it can't be compared to any other country. Therefore, it deserves unique treatment. And this is the argument, I quote in my report one example from a legal opinion by a British KC, arguing that Israel is unlike any other country in the manner of its founding, in the displacement of large numbers of Palestinians, the way it acquired territory through war, its alleged human rights abuses, and so on. So it can't be treated like any other country. Now, I find this argument to be very weak and historically quite ignorant. You know, without going into the details of circumstances of Israel's formation or its politics and behaviour today, there are many countries around the world, both today and throughout history, that have been accused of all of the things that Israel is accused of. Some of them in exactly the same combination, some of them to a much worse degree, to have proven to have done them. So the idea that Israel has committed some kind of unique sin or unique set of crimes that deserves unique treatment is, it's factually incorrect, it's historically wrong, but also it does kind of feed into this old idea that I was talking about earlier, that Jews bear a unique stain, a unique sin that they carry throughout time, throughout history, that they stand between humanity and some utopian future. So it's an argument that I think is not just wrong and quite weak, but there's just a troubling echo in there as well.
Dr. Rich, that opening statement that criticism of Israel similar to that levelled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic really needs to be read together with the 8th example concerning the double standards. And importantly, in that 8th example, it is said that behaviour not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. So that, correct me if I'm wrong, seems to me significant. So comparisons when one looks at people, for example, protesting about Palestinians, a response that sometimes comes back to that sort of protest activity is, why aren't they campaigning about the Uyghurs? Why aren't they campaigning about criticism of the conduct of North Korea? And it would seem to me, looking at example 8, it's because the relevant comparator is a democracy. Is that a fair way of viewing the application of the working definition?
So I think Commissioner, I think you're absolutely right that these two things go together. And I think example 8 about applying double standards, I write in my report, this is the example I think that should be treated with the most caution. Because, look, we all pick and choose our causes and things we're interested in, but this idea of demanding, by requiring of Israel a behaviour not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. So I'd say a couple of things about this. One of them is, personally, I think there's nothing wrong with expecting minimum standards of behaviour from every country, whether they're a democracy or not. But this is the definition as it's written. Secondly, I think a lot of the arguments that are... Well, secondly, I'd say a lot of the people who protest against Israel do not view it as a democratic nation. Right? They view it as a nation that practices apartheid and occupation and so on and so on. So by their own standards, this clause wouldn't really be relevant to their protest choices because they wouldn't see it as a democracy. And the third thing I'd say is it still doesn't answer the question of why, you know, there are conflicts around the world, I'm thinking in Yemen, in Sudan, where the immediate protagonists may not be democracies, but they are very much allies of Western nations. They are using arms that are provided by Western democracies. And so I think the idea of that we in the West have an element of connection and responsibility still applies. Yeah. And so it still raises the question of why don't they protest, not just in the same amount, but with the same feeling about those issues as they do for the Palestinians. And I think that remains an unanswered question.
Thank you.
Just to take you back for a moment to example 7, which is denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavour. You make the observation in paragraph 4.40 of your report that, in your view, example 7 says nothing about specific Israeli practices and laws, only that it may be anti-Semitic to argue that the fundamental existence of the entire state is, quote, a racist endeavour, unquote. Could you elaborate on that?
Look, that's exactly correct. If you look at the wording of that clause, it says it may, depending on the context, be anti-Semitic to deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination. And an example of how that might be expressed might be to argue that the existence, the entire existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavour. Now, my reading of that clause is that there is nothing there to prevent people from arguing that the Israeli government behaves in a racist way, that the Israeli state has racist laws or racist structures, that the creation of Israel involved discriminatory practices. These are all legitimate areas for historical analysis, for political argument, and so on and so on. There's nothing, by my reading, there's nothing in the definition that would prevent any of that. And I think that is an example of where some critics of the definition and some supporters of the Palestinian cause overinterpret what the definition actually says about what they want to be saying and doing. And actually, it allows much more latitude and much more room for those arguments and those kind of campaigns to take place without falling under the kind of remit of the definition.
When you refer to latitude for those types of campaigns to take place, I take it you're referring to criticism of individual or specific policies of the State of Israel. Is that right?
That's correct, or arguing that there are racist laws in Israel or racist practices. I mean, you know, there are many countries, including many liberal democracies around the world, that are regularly accused by campaigners of having racist laws or racist practices. That doesn't touch on the idea that their existence as states are racist endeavours. That's a completely different thing. So I think it's exactly that kind of argument that it shouldn't be touched by the definition, really.
In the end of this section of your report, you've drawn attention to some organisations that have asked and answered the question as to whether the deployment of IRA definition of anti-Semitism has perceptibly changed the free speech calculus or the consideration of free speech, and you refer to the UK Parliamentary Task Force in paragraph 4.49. Could you just address briefly what that found?
So this was the UK Parliamentary Task Force on Antisemitism in Higher Education. They visited 56 different universities around the UK, and as part of their review of what was happening with anti-Semitism in those campuses, they asked them about how they found, what was their experience of using the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. As I said earlier, I think around 240 institutions of higher education have adopted or used the definition. And this task force reported that, in their words, the answers were unequivocal and consistent across universities, that the definition has neither compromised nor chilled free speech in any of the 56 universities with which we engaged. They said this demonstrates it's being used appropriately, and any suggestion it should be a restrictor on academic freedom is to misread or misinterpret the definition. In fact, it went on to say that the task force said that there are multiple examples of where institutions have used the IHRA definition in a positive way as an educational tool in developing training modules about anti-Semitism.
Thanks. Dr. Rich, I'll take you now to question 4 that you asked to address in your report. And in that question, you were asked what are the key drivers and manifestations of contemporary anti-Semitism in liberal democracies, and how are they similar or different to historical drivers and manifestations? You've referred to a number of publications of organisations that have assessed worldwide anti-Semitism, and in particular you've referred to 3 reports over the years 2013, 2018 and 2024 of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. What did you take from your comparison of those 3 reports?
So this is, as you say, the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, and they've conducted 3 surveys of Jewish perceptions and experiences of anti-Semitism in 12 or 13 EU member states. It's not exactly the same list across all three reports. The United Kingdom, for obvious reasons, was not included in the 2024 report, but it was in the two previous ones. And amongst many different questions, this was a very, very large survey, I think tens of thousands of respondents across these countries. And amongst many different questions they asked about experiences, how many people had been the victim of anti-Semitic harassment, where that harassment happened, who did it, did they report it to anyone, etc., etc. And in particular, and this was relevant for this issue of key drivers, they asked people who'd experienced anti-Semitic harassment within the previous 12 months or the previous 5 years, can you describe the perpetrator? And they had a whole load of categories. And those categories included someone with a Muslim extremist view, someone with a right-wing political view, someone with a left-wing political view, someone with an extremist Christian view. They also asked about age and gender and so on. And what all three reports showed is that on that particular question of ideology, the most common description was that the incident of anti-Semitic harassment was carried out by someone with a Muslim extremist view. Not the majority, it was 27%, 30 in one, 30% in another. Then someone with a left-wing political view, which was normally around 22%, well 33% in 2018, and then someone with a right-wing view. So across all three reports and across all these different EU countries, you basically had Jewish victims of anti-Semitic harassment reporting that harassment came from people presenting as having a range of different extremist viewpoints, Muslim or Islamist. They used different language in different reports. Left-wing, right-wing, Christian were all present in the mix, but the most common was people with a Muslim or Islamist extremist view.
And you have referred in paragraph 5.17 and following to a shift, or to the ideological underpinnings of the shift that you've identified. Could you explain that, please?
Sure. So if you go back before the modern period into kind of medieval times, Muslim majority countries on the whole were much more welcoming and hospitable to Jews than Christian Europe was, on the whole. I mean, I'm overly generalising. Not necessarily equality by sort of modern human rights standards, but by the standards of the day, much better. In the 19th and into the 20th century, you get a shift whereby the negative ideas about Jews that exist. Look, all religions have positive and negative texts and sources you can use about anything, right? So within Islamic traditions, there are negative sources, negative commentaries about Jews there for people who want to use them, if they want to cherry pick in that way. What happened in the 20th century is that got blended with modern European anti-Semitism that was of a much more politicized, much more conspiratorial, much more genocidal nature, a lot of which came from Nazi propaganda, but also post-war from Soviet propaganda, and also just more traditional anti-Semitism that came into the Middle East through colonialism. And these kind of blended together. Then that Islamist anti-Semitism in the modern day kind of combines with far-left extremism that you find, and they meet. There's also an anti-Semitic tradition in left-wing thought, and these two different traditions of anti-Semitism find a common ground in two things, really: in an extreme hatred of Israel and a desire to get rid of Israel, and in the representation of Israel as a kind of uniquely evil, demonic, cruel force in the world, and also in a conspiratorial view of Israel and Zionism and of Jews as kind of being, controlling Western governments and undermining Islam and causing world war and so on. And these two trends sort of combine together, and it's that mixture that is giving the emotional heft to a lot of the anti-Semitism and a lot of the extremism that Jewish communities are facing today.
Your report goes into some detail in describing those two traditions that you've just identified in your answer, and I'll ask you about each of them. What you describe as far left extremism, I'll come to in a moment, but first could I ask you to address the radical Islamist anti-Semitic tradition as you describe it, to explain the source of that. I think you referred to it as a cherry-picking exercise, but the way it's manifested in contemporary discourse.
So this is, when we talk about Islamist anti-Semitism or Islamist extremism, we're talking about the ideological beliefs, the ideas and the output of specific political organisations and the political traditions and ideologies that they promote. And this is organisations like the Muslim Brotherhood, the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is the kind of South Asian equivalent of the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafi jihadi organisations like Al-Qaeda, and also the kind of Shia equivalents to Shia Islamism of the Iranian regime and Hezbollah and so on. And what the ideology of these groups do is they kind of blend together negative commentary about Jews that they'll pick and choose from the Quran, from other religious texts, from other parts of Islamic tradition, of which, there is positive and negative, and they'll take the bits they want. And they weave them together with the influence of European 20th century anti-Semitism, and some of these groups in their formative period in the sort of 1920s, 1930s and 40s were very influenced by European anti-Semitic ideas. And they will present this as an explanation for why Israel is there and why Israel behaves the way they see it as behaving. Except very often in the way they talk about it, they talk about the Jews, not about Israel. So you get this very anti-Semitic language as a way of explaining why the Arab national movement failed to prevent the creation of Israel in 1948, why Arab countries have been repeatedly been defeated by Israel in war, why colonialism happened. I mean, all these different things get pinned onto this kind of anti-Semitic framing that blends all these different sources and traditions.
You've referred as one of your specific examples in this context to the Charter of Hamas published in 1988, and you observe that charter quotes directly from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. What does it say about that?
That's exactly right. I mean, the charter, it has the kind of religious Islamic language you'd expect from Hamas. So it talks about how the Palestinian struggle is a religious jihad against the Jews. There's no solution except through jihad, etc., etc. But then it has an analysis of why Israel exists and of Israel and Zionism that says not just that Zionism is a threat to Palestine, but that there is a global Zionist conspiracy that threatens the entire world. It says the Zionist plan is limitless. After Palestine, the Zionists aspire to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates. When they will have digested the region they overtook, they will aspire to further expansion and so on. And then it says their plan is embodied in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and their present conduct is the best proof of what we are saying. So it's the key core text of European anti-Semitism the book that was, compulsory teaching in Nazi Germany, that has been labelled by one of the main historians who wrote about the protocols, called it a warrant for genocide. And that is written into the founding charter of Hamas, framed within this framing of a kind of jihadist call to arms.
You're given some other examples in this section of your report, but could I move to the other key ideological driver of radical left-wing thought and activism? And you've said that there is a tradition in far left social and political thought that has sustained anti-Semitism. What's your view about that?
There is, and this sometimes feels a bit counterintuitive, because the left historically has, largely speaking, stood against anti-Semitism, certainly when anti-Semitism was a product primarily of the far right in the fight against fascism in the 1930s and 1940s, and so on. And so we are used to the idea that the left is anti-racist and it's opposed to anti-Semitism, and mostly across all of the left and all of its history that has been the case. But within left-wing thought, and as a kind of mainstream, if usually minor tradition within left-wing thought, there has always been an anti-Semitic strain. And this goes back to really the early period of the formative period of socialist thinking in the early 19th, late 18th, early 19th century, into the mid-19th century, when the status of Jews in Europe was a sort of very common discussion in European politics. It became known as the Jewish question. Jews had been emancipated, they were gaining civil rights all over Europe, and a lot of people were very alarmed by this, because Jews had always been seen as a threat within society, and all of a sudden this threat was being let loose. And how do we handle that? And different left-wing thinkers, very, very prominent, famous left-wing thinkers and writers, up to and including Karl Marx himself, wrote books about, what do we do about the Jews? Do we force them to give up their Jewishness? Do they have to stop being Jewish? Or can they carry on being Jewish but just stop doing all the bad bits of being Jewish? And these ideas all went backwards and forwards. And it even got to the point where, and this was at a time where left-wing parties were trying to obviously win support of mass movements, and large parts of European populations to varying degrees were anti-Semitic, and you had some people on the left using anti-Semitic ideas to try and attract people to socialism. And this was so common that the head of the main German socialist, the Social Democratic Party, August Bebel, came up with a phrase, or is ascribed to having come up with the phrase, he may not have actually invented it, that anti-Semitism was the socialism of fools. That this combination was so common that it actually needed addressing, that people who think anti-Semitism can ever work as a socialist idea are fools. But the fact that he said it meant there were people on the left trying it, and trying it to the point that he felt the need to condemn it. Now, you look more recently, the Soviet Union, throughout the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, were pumping out anti-Semitic propaganda all the time in Western languages, a lot of it in English, that were dressing up anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about rich Jews controlling capitalism and, undermining and attacking, in this context, Palestinians and so on. But it was basically anti-Semitic conspiracy ideas, but framed as Zionism. So they would just literally, in a very explicit way, the word Zionism would be swapped in, and quite often used alongside talking about Judaism. So one book published by the Soviet Union in 1980 called Israel, the Reality Behind the Myths, said Zionism is the ideology and policy of the Jewish bourgeoisie, forms part of the worldwide financial oligarchy, part of the system of monopoly capitalism. So these conspiracy ideas, Jews, money, Zionism, power, were part of Soviet propaganda that were pushed out to the Western left in many countries, and I think left a very clear legacy in the kind of conspiracy thinking about Zionism that we see in parts of left-wing anti-Semitism today.
Dr. Rich, I might now ask you to turn your attention to the question 5, which could I just ask before we get there, you're comfortable and happy to continue?
Yep.
Right,
yep.
Thank you. Question 5 was explain Zionism and anti-Zionism and whether those concepts have a connection to anti-Semitism. Could I ask you first to address Zionism, because you have set out over a number of pages your answer to the question, what is Zionism?
So Zionism, in short, is the idea that the Jewish people are a people, that their ancient homeland is the land of Israel, that they have a right to national self-determination, and that the modern state of Israel is the manifestation of that right in the modern world. Now, Zionism as a movement was the movement that led to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. It emerged in the late 19th century in lots of different forms. There were lots of different versions of Zionism, but not all of which were political, not all of which wanted a state, but political Zionism that ended up leading the drive to statehood became the dominant strand. And so up until the creation of Israel in 1948, Zionism meant effectively the political campaign to try and create a Jewish homeland or a Jewish state in the ancient Jewish homeland of the land of Israel, like wherever the borders would actually end up in that area, that territory. Now, since Israel has existed, the meaning of Zionism also changes, because it no longer makes sense for Zionism to mean the campaign to create something that already exists. So it's come to mean support for Israel's ongoing existence, support for its well-being, a kind of ideological affiliation or connection with Israel. For a lot of Jewish people, it's become wrapped up in their own Jewish identity as well. But so it's changed over time.
And I think you've described it in its current usage as coming to denote support for the State of Israel as the political expression of Jewish national self-determination, and the idea that the State of Israel plays a central role in global Jewish life. How does that sit or connect with the criticism of Israeli government policy, in your view?
They're different things, really. As I said, Zionism always had different strands. Israel, is a multi-party parliamentary democracy, and so the political, just at a very basic level, in Israel, the parliamentary opposition, the political opposition, will be Zionists, will define as Zionists, but will oppose everything the government does, as happens in every multi-party democracy. More broadly, for Jewish people around the world, Zionism, as I said, it's the idea that the State of Israel should exist, that it is the Jewish people identify with it to varying degrees and in different ways, that it's part of the Jewish world, a central part of the Jewish world. Now that is the case whoever's in power in Israel. That's completely different from supporting this Israeli government or that Israeli government, this policy or that policy, or even having a view on Israeli politics at all. It's a different category of being. It's a completely separate thing. And you can be completely opposed to everything the Israeli government does, and you're just as much a Zionist as someone who supports everything the Israeli government does, because you share this belief that Israel is the manifestation of Jewish national self-determination in the ancient Jewish homeland.
You were also asked what is anti-Zionism, and I think your first reaction, your first expression of your answer was rejection of Jewish national self-determination and opposition to the existence of the current state of Israel. Could you elaborate on expressions of opinion that might be characterised as anti-Zionism?
So that's exactly right. Anti-Zionism is the antithesis of what I've just described as Zionism, and they're both positions in principle rather than in detail, if you like. But an expression of anti-Zionism would be the idea calling for Israel not to exist, arguing that Jews are not a real people, that they're not a real nation, that they don't have the right to self-determination, supporting campaigns whose goal is to end the existence of the state of Israel. One very well-known slogan that gets used a lot is the idea, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which we hear on a lot of protests. Now, that's actually an English translation of an Arab slogan, an Arab phrase, which says, from the river to the sea, Palestine is Arab. But they both mean the same thing, which is that between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, that land that is currently Israel and Palestine should only be Palestine, and there shouldn't be Israel. So that would be an anti-Zionist slogan.
You do observe that much of what gets described as anti-Zionism is not, strictly speaking, anti-Zionist at all. What are you intending to convey by that?
That's correct. Because anti-Zionism is a principled opposition, or an opposition in principle, let's say, to the existence of the State of Israel. So, criticising Israeli government policy, opposing Israeli government policy, opposing and criticising Israeli military actions, none of those meet the threshold of anti-Zionism. They would all fall below that, because you can do all of those things and still be a Zionist. So a lot of what gets described as anti-Zionist language, anti-Zionist behaviour, is really better described as anti-Israel rather than anti-Zionist or anti the Israeli government, let's say.
You refer to some different forms of anti-Zionism, and one of the examples you give is a body of thought among some strictly Orthodox Jews who adhere to the religious belief that Jews should only return to the land of Israel during a divinely inspired messianic age. Is that capable of being anti-Semitic in your view?
In and of itself, no. It's a brand of Jewish theology, and as such, I don't see how that would be described as anti-Semitic.
And you also refer to another example of Marxist criticism who reject the existence of a state of Israel because it contradicts Marxist theory of social organisation. In what context might that be anti-Semitic?
So that's where there's more of a possibility, as I've described. A lot of there is, an anti-Semitic strand in Marxist theory and socialist theory about Jews, Jewish nationhood, and Jewish identity. And so Marxist opposition to Zionism can sometimes invoke those kind of quite negative, pejorative ideas about Jewishness and about Jewish identity. And they can also manifest in political campaigns from far-left groups that then bring in other kind of anti-Semitic language. So I think that's one where it's more common for there to be some anti-Semitism in there as well.
One other aspect of this part of your report is you identify an idea that Zionism is a form of European settler colonialism, and you've identified critics who reframe the Israeli-Palestinian conflict not as a clash of two national movements, but as a struggle between coloniser and colonised. What is your analysis of that type of criticism?
This is something that has become very common in the last few years. So Israel, the Zionist movement was operating from the late 19th century and through the 20th century until Israel's formation in 1948. And like any kind of nascent national movement trying to create a homeland or a state, obviously they dealt with the great powers at the time, many of which were European colonial powers. And then when it came to bringing Jewish migrants to what was then Mandate Palestine, or Palestine in the Ottoman Empire and Mandate Palestine in the British Empire, they were building settlements for people to live in. They were buying land and so on. So I think there's a legitimate investigation and critique to be made about colonial engagement and colonial practices in the history of the Zionist movement and in Israel post-independence in the West Bank and so on. But what I'm talking about is something different. I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is this narrative that has developed that Zionism is nothing other than a form of Western colonialism that basically stole someone else's land for European colonizers. And these European colonizers being Jews. And this is both historically wrong and also quite dangerous. It's historically wrong for a number of reasons. Firstly, because Jews have an ancient and legitimate connection to the land of Israel, which obviously is different from European colonizers that spread out around the globe from the kind of 15th century onwards. Jews were always living in the land of Israel. They had sovereignty in part of the land of Israel in ancient times, and even after that period, there were still Jews living there throughout. There was a continuous Jewish presence. Again, that's very, very different from how European colonialism operated. And thirdly, the Jews who migrated to Palestine under the Ottomans and then under the British, and then to Israel post-independence, were not emissaries of European colonialism coming to take land and exploit, plunder and so on for the mother country back home. They were refugees fleeing anti-Semitism who were pushed out, squeezed out of their own home societies and needed a new home somewhere else. So historically, the argument doesn't stand up. Now, the danger of it is, in kind of modern radical left theory about colonialism, colonizers can never have rights, and their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren remain colonizers and never acquire rights. And therefore, in this theory, the whole of Israel is illegally occupied, and therefore Palestinians have the right to use armed force, armed resistance to attack and kill any Israelis anywhere in Israel. And we saw this after the October 7th attack, when all of the towns and kibbutzim attacked by Hamas on that day were inside sovereign Israel, not in legally disputed territory, in Israel itself. And yet you had purveyors of this anti-colonial narrative about Israel, including, tenured professors in American universities and all the rest of it, saying, well, what do they expect? They're colonizers. This is what happens to colonizers. Now they'll finally realize, about families in a kibbutz in southern Israel. So it's a narrative that prohibits compromise. It mitigates against the idea of working for peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and it justifies the use of violence against Israeli civilians within Israel itself. And then the ripple effect from that is, because colonialism and settler colonialism are seen as manifestations of European racism and white supremacy, therefore in this thinking, anyone who supports Israel in the West, anyone who's a Zionist, is therefore a colonizer, is therefore a racist, therefore can be excluded, can be attacked, can be demonized, and so on. And that's what we see happening to a lot of Jewish people now.
Thanks, Dr. Rich. The sixth of the questions you were asked was, what threat does anti-Semitism pose to Jewish people and to social cohesion in liberal democracies more generally? You of course address what I would understand many people to answer that question by identifying topics such as physical harm and professional discrimination, social cohesion, diminution of Jewish life. Can I ask you just to address in this context your observation in 7.10 that at its heart anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory, and how this plays out in manifestations in society?
This is exactly right. The core idea of anti-Semitism is that the Jews are always up to something. You can't trust them. They've always got a hidden agenda. It's a conspiracy theory. And it's a conspiracy theory that claims that whatever's happening in the world, the story you're being told about it by the authorities isn't true. Because the true story is that there's some Jews somewhere pulling the strings, making it happen, whether that's all Jews or the Rothschilds or the State of Israel or the Zionist lobby or whatever. Now, the impacts of this, if this spreads, is that it reinforces conspiracy theory interpretations of the world, of society. It undermines trust in institutions and trust in authority, because it tells people that governments, mainstream media, police, established authorities, even science, they're all lying to you because they're not telling you the truth about who's really doing things. And this is why anti-Semitism is a common feature of every type of political and religious extremism, or certainly those that are manifesting in this way. It's common in far-right extremism, far-left extremism, Islamist extremism, and other types as well, because it is a conspiracy theory and because extremist politics is predicated on a conspiratorial understanding of the world. It's also why anti-Semitism in softer versions crops up in a lot of populist politics as well. So it's fundamentally, it's not just undemocratic, it's anti-democratic. It damages the core values of liberal democracy.
It is not just a fundamental problem for the Jewish community.
If anti-Semitism takes root in the mainstream of a society, it not only tells us there is something fundamentally wrong about that society, it also stands in the way of repairing that damage. So history shows again and again, societies where anti-Semitism take root will always fail one way or another. The only question is how much damage gets done before things are corrected. So absolutely, the growth of anti-Semitism, the spread of anti-Semitism from the fringes of society and the margins to the mainstream should be a huge alarm call for everybody who cares about liberal democracy, about truth, about the rule of law, about trust in institutions, and about social cohesion.
Dr. Rich, I don't have any further questions, thank you, but Ms. Dwyer, I think, has some questions for you.
Perhaps just
Thank you.
before that, Dr. Rich, two things. Firstly, you mentioned a short time ago the significance of a continuous Jewish presence in the area known as Palestine prior to the establishment of the State of Israel. And you mentioned the significance of Jewish people arriving in Palestine after World War II as refugees. Is it the case that after the end of World War II and the disclosure of the Holocaust, Jews who returned to Poland in some cases were subjected to pogroms in, I think, 1945 or 1946?
That's exactly correct. Those Jews who survived the Holocaust and who made their way back to their homes, in many cases were not welcomed by their former neighbours, some of whom had taken their homes. In some cases were attacked. In one famous case in 1946, there was a pogrom, which was around a blood libel, a ritual murder charge of a missing child, in which a large number of Jewish people were killed. And this really cemented the idea for those survivors of the Holocaust that Europe could not ever be a safe home for them again, and they had to find a different home. And the only place available was a new state of Israel. The small numbers of survivors were taken in by other countries. Some came to Britain. I know a lot went to Australia and so on. But most ended up going to Israel.
So that is the context in which the United Nations settled on the partition of the former British Mandate of Palestine.
It was. Now, of course, Zionism existed a long time before then.
Yeah.
And the argument for Jewish self-determination predated the Holocaust. But it created an irresistible moral argument and also a very urgent practical need as well.
Now, Dr. Rich, the second point, as Mr. Lancaster indicated, Ms. Dwyer, who appears on behalf of the Jewish Council, would like to ask you some questions, and possibly Mr. Sheehan, who appears for the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, amongst other organisations. Mm-hmm. Would you like a short break before that commences?
No, I'm okay. We can carry on.
Thank you.
Commissioner, there has been a request from others in court for a very short break, if that is suitable.
Well, you have better powers of control, Dr. Rich, than some. I'll take a 5-minute break.
Okay.
Thanks, Dr. Rich. I think we are now ready to resume.
Right.
Dr. Rich, can you see and hear me okay?
I can.
Great. Dr. Rich, it's clear from your report and from the evidence you're giving today that you emphasise the importance of nuance in a lot of the discussions as to what may or may not be anti-Semitism. And I just want to
some occasions more than others, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to take you to some examples to help tease out what might be some of the challenges of having reasonable debates around these issues. The first one relates to the examples you give about Nazi comparisons. I preface these questions by saying that the Jewish Council of Australia has cautioned against the use of Nazi symbology, but wants to ensure legitimate criticism of Israel is not weaponised. So can I take you to your report at page 13?
Yeah.
You see that at the bottom of that first paragraph you say, to a certain extent, this is part of a wider social phenomenon whereby Nazism has understandably become the yardstick for evil, but when it's deployed against Jews, including in the form of Israel, a Jewish state, it carries extra anti-Semitic meaning.
That's at the top of page 13.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
You'd accept, wouldn't you, that whether comparisons with the actions of Nazi actors to the state of Israel, whether that is or isn't anti-Semitic, depends on circumstances and nuance?
I mean, it depends on a lot of things, but I think the starting point is that it usually is anti-Semitic, but
Indeed,
it's hard to think of situations where it wouldn't be.
I'm going to take you to some. The IRA definition makes it clear, doesn't it, that drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of Nazis may or may not be anti-Semitic, depending on the context.
Yeah, that's correct.
And on Tuesday, Professor Marcus, whose study Crossroads 23 you cited in your report, gave evidence to this commission that whether or not comparison of Israel's actions to Nazi Germany is anti-Semitic would totally, his words, totally depend on the context. You'd agree with that?
There's always context.
Okay. That's consistent with the 2025 British Employment Tribunal hearing that you refer to, which said, depending on the context, a criticism of Israel which pointedly uses Nazi language and imagery as a racialised taunt of this kind could reasonably be regarded as anti-Semitic, but allows for context in circumstances where use of Nazi comparisons may not be. Do you agree?
That's correct, yeah.
I just want to take you to some examples where it might not be. Concerning settler violence to Palestinians in the West Bank, a former head of Mossad said recently, and I quote, "My mother was a Holocaust survivor, and what I saw reminded me of the events that happened against Jews in the last century." It couldn't be suggested that that was anti-Semitic. Do you agree?
So I find any use of the Holocaust as a political tool in these debates I just think is wrong. There are many other historical comparisons that could be used. For example, comparisons to settler violence in the West Bank. There are many other scenarios around the world and in history that would be very accurate comparisons to make. When people use the Holocaust as a comparison, I think I would not accuse a former head of the Mossad of being anti-Semitic. But I think what he's doing in this situation is reaching for the Holocaust as a point of comparison precisely because he knows how provocative and how sensitive it is. because it plays on and triggers Jewish sensitivities. Now, within the context of internal Israeli politics, people do this a lot. I don't like it, but they do it. That's Israeli politics. I think once you take that outside of that arena, it starts to have a very different meaning.
My point, Dr. Rich, is that these comparisons might be wrong and they might be hurtful and they might be extremely sensitive, but not necessarily anti-Semitic, and it's important to draw a distinction.
It's true, but I go with Mr. Justice Chamberlain's line that usually they could reasonably be regarded as anti-Semitic unless there's some extraordinary context otherwise.
The statement by some Israeli officials referring to Palestinians as human animals has been compared by some commentators to Nazi propaganda that dehumanised Jewish people. Do you accept that someone might say that? You can agree or disagree, but it's not necessarily anti-Semitic to have that debate about dehumanised words.
So in that particular case, I believe that was a statement by Yoav Gallant, and he was talking about Hamas specifically, not about all Palestinians. I think I don't accept that talking about a military enemy in dehumanised terms is the same as talking about a civilian population. In that way, I think it's a different context.
You can agree or disagree then with the use of that comparison, but what I'm suggesting to you is it's not necessarily anti-Semitic.
What's not necessarily anti-Semitic?
To draw a comparison to a tool of Nazi propaganda.
Well, again, I ask, why reach for that comparison? And I think where Israel is concerned, the reason why very often that's the first comparison people to reach to when there are many others available is because Israel is Jewish and because the Holocaust happened to Jewish people. And therefore it's deliberately playing on Jewish sensitivities and using Israel's Jewishness as the line of attack. And so I'd have a big problem with it, yeah, I do.
You've got a big problem with it, but it may not be anti-Semitic.
Well, I think it usually is.
Some genocide scholars, human rights organisations, NGOs, have accused Israel of committing acts of genocide in Gaza. Now, you can agree or disagree with that proposition, but it's not anti-Semitic to have that debate, is it?
So some of the contributions to that debate, I would say, are anti-Semitic and some aren't.
You gave evidence earlier about the use of Nazi comparisons being hurtful, and I certainly don't dispute that. But you drew from that to say the implication is that we don't have to worry about the Holocaust anymore. Do you recall giving that evidence this morning?
Yeah, I didn't say that's an implication of it being hurtful. I said that's another layer, a more subtle layer at which it operates.
But do you accept that someone could be making a comparison with the horrors of the Nazi era to say we cannot let that happen again?
Yeah.
On a number of occasions in your report, you call out the anti-Semitic representation of Jewish people regarding treatment of children or actions towards children, and I don't dispute the examples that you gave, of course. You say sometimes it verges into classic anti-Semitic blood libel to say Israel has an unusual taste for bloodletting, that's page 8, or delights in shedding the blood of children, that's paragraph 5.17. I want to compare that to criticisms of Israel for the effect on children from the war in Gaza. It's widely accepted that around 1,200 people were killed in Israel because of the terrible attacks on 7th of October. You'd accept that?
Yeah. And
in February this year, UNICEF reported that more than 71,000 Palestinians have been killed in the Gaza Strip. Do you accept those figures?
I mean, broadly, I think those figures are more contested, but as a broad ballpark, yes.
as a broad ballpark, do you accept the figures from UNICEF that at least 21,000 of those killed are children?
For the sake of argument, let's say yes. I'm not an expert on the casualty figures from Gaza, but let's take it as read.
You'd accept that people might be very angry and upset about the number of children killed in this war?
Yes.
And it's not inherently anti-Semitic for somebody to criticise Israel for their conduct in this war that's resulted in the death of those children?
No, it's not.
And indeed, holding and expressing negative, even strongly negative views of Israel for that conduct is not anti-Semitic, is it, necessarily?
No, it's not.
Just want to return to the coloniser-colonised framework that Mr Lancaster of Senior Counsel was asking you about. I'll take you to the IRA definition coming up, but you say in referring to the concerns about IRA that inclusion of example 7 has led to 2 concerns. One is that it prevents people from arguing that specific Israeli policies, practices and laws are racist, and 2, that it prevents open examination of the historical circumstances of Israel's creation, including the displacement of Palestinian refugees. That's paragraph 4.39 of your report. And you say, in effect, there's no need for that concern because open debate around those issues is allowed.
Yeah.
However, what you say at paragraph 5.42 is to warn against the coloniser-colonised framework because it's a driver of anti-Semitism.
So this is where, as I said earlier in my answer to Mr. Lancaster, there is an entirely valid area of historical inquiry and political discussion around the engagement between the Zionist movement and the various colonial powers in the pre-state era, and Israel's colonial practices, both pre-state and in the West Bank, up to the present day and so on. And that is entirely valid. Then separate to that, you have this very simplifying and kind of demonizing political narrative that Israel and Israelis are nothing other than colonizers. Now, when this is used as a political campaign, it has all the implications I explained earlier in terms of justifying violence against Israelis. It also implicitly erases a large part of Jewish history and Jewish religion and Jewish culture in terms of connection to the land. And what you're touching on here is anti-Semitism very often is like a shadow form of legitimate discussion. You'll have your legitimate discussion, you'll have your anti-Semitic version of that legitimate politics or history and so on. And sometimes we do have to tread very delicately in sort of teasing them apart.
Because you're giving evidence on the back of years of research and scholarship about when it may or may not be legitimate to discuss colonisation. But other people having this debate may not share your eloquence or historical understanding. Can I suggest to you some people might engage in that debate and use the term coloniser and colonised without being anti-Semitic?
I think I agree with you. There's a huge amount of ignorance. A lot of people pick up slogans and things they see on whatever their latest Instagram reel, and they don't really understand it. But the meaning, that doesn't completely erase the fact that there may be an inadvertent anti-Semitic meaning in there. I say in my report, most people who use anti-Semitic language are very often not aware that they are doing so. And these things are complicated.
You're giving evidence from a former colonial power. We're sitting here in this commission in a country that was colonised. It's possible, isn't it, to grapple with history, which includes some level of colonisation, without being labelled a racist or an anti-Semite?
That's true. I think what happens in both of our countries is that a lot of historic guilt and angst about that history gets projected and displaced onto Israel as a kind of easy scapegoat.
You are at pains, I suggest, to encourage respectful debate around these issues. Would you agree with me?
Yes.
I guess my point is, in today's age, it's important to allow for that debate without shouting someone down as anti-Semitic or racist if they don't express themselves perfectly or if they are angry.
Yes, respect goes both ways, and I think where people express hurt or concern about language that is used, that should be taken in good faith and listened to.
Yes. Can I come now to the IRA definition? At paragraph 4.27, you refer to concerns that are expressed by a number of different individuals and agencies.
Yeah.
They include legal opinions from eminent lawyers like Tomlinson, KC, and Jeffrey Robertson, KC, scholars like Dr. Brian Klug and Professor Amos Goldberg, and you include a letter by 104 civil society organisations to the UN Secretary General. In relation to that letter from 104 organisations, that included organisations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and Physicians for Human Rights. Am I correct?
That's correct.
So serious non-government organisations who represent a significant number of people expressing those concerns. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
And you say in your statement you're aware that there's a criticism of the IRA definition, that it's vague, unclear, and potentially confusing. And you accept that, to a certain extent, those critics have a point about that.
Well, yes, but I think that's its value. I think they're wrong in wanting it to be to be unqualified and unconditional and wanting a definitive definition. I think that misses the point of what the definition is for.
Let me take you to some of the problems it might have, not for you, Dr. Rich, but for other people trying to rely on this definition, as it's called. In paragraph 4.38, you take the two examples in the definition that relate only to Israel. And you say there's a great deal of room for subjective opinion about what constitutes legitimate criticism of Israel. You see that? Or you'd accept that?
Well, I say it's a subjective question, yeah.
And the IRA definition makes it plain that whether or not something is or isn't anti-Semitic depends critically on context, correct?
Yes.
And it can
Yes.
depend can depend on what somebody's intention is or what's in their mind.
I mean, that is one of many contextual parts of it.
I want to suggest to you that a definition that is vague and has room for subjectivity and that might depend on what is in someone's mind has serious flaws as a definition. You would accept that, wouldn't you?
No, because the problem is what the thing we are trying to define and identify is itself sometimes vague and a bit subjective. You know, there are many examples of anti-Semitism that are very clear, but there are also many examples where it isn't quite clear, and you can't just say a particular word or a particular phrase is always anti-Semitic or is never anti-Semitic. The answer is very often, sometimes, depending on the context. So if you're going to have a practical definition of anti-Semitism that will actually be useful, and useful in the way that it was originally conceived and designed, it has to have that flexibility written into it.
But you go so far as to say that the limitations of the IRA definition mean that it shouldn't even be called a definition, it should be called something else.
Well, no, I just say look, I don't get hung up on names, to be honest. I think what it is, in practical terms, is a guide for people who have to investigate allegations of anti-Semitism. And as such, I think it is very, very useful and very, very practical.
Why not
If
label
the
it?
philosophers and lawyers that I quote are hung up on the word definition, I think that is a very, very minor feature.
Why not label it then a guide to interpretation of whether something is or isn't anti-Semitism?
I mean, you know, you'd have to be in whatever EU committee room 20 odd years ago to make that argument.
You identify as a criticism that is commonly made of that IRA definition that the imprecise language encourages supporters of Israel to try to use the definition to close down legitimate criticisms of Israel. That's at paragraph 4.32 of your report.
So that's an allegation that is made by its critics.
Yes, and it's an allegation made by a number of critics and serious scholars in the area, isn't it?
It is, but there's not much evidence to back it up.
Another criticism that you identify at paragraph 4.47 is that it shuts down pro-Palestinian activities. That's a criticism made of it.
That is a criticism that is made, yes.
Indeed, the IRA definition was developed by Kenneth Stern, is that right?
Not as much as he makes out, no.
He was
He was one of quite a large group of academics and practitioners who were involved.
who were involved in drafting the definition and the examples, correct?
Yeah.
And he has said publicly that the IRA definition has been weaponised to silence pro-Palestinian speech. You're aware of that?
I mean, I'm not aware of that exact phrase, but I know what his position is on it.
At paragraph 4.50, you refer to the European Legal Support Centre's report of 40 accusations of anti-Semitism against university staff or students on the basis of the IRA definition. All but two of those were rejected and the other two were unresolved. And you don't contest the veracity of that report, you accept that?
I mean, I have not investigated it, so I don't know what the exact content of each of those 40 allegations were, but this is what the report said.
The report said there were 40 allegations, all but two of which were rejected. Would you accept, Dr. Rich, that in terms of a chilling effect on free speech, it's relevant not only whether accusations are proved, but the fact that they are made can have a chilling impact on free speech, can't it?
Potentially, but I don't know. I'd love to say I have such faith in the disciplinary processes of British universities that they would investigate accusations of anti-Semitism accurately, but I don't honestly know the content of all of those 40 cases.
All right,
So
I'm referring to a report that you cite here, but it's a terrible thing to be called anti-Semitic. Can I suggest to you, people operating in good faith, reasonable people, would be appalled to be called anti-Semitic.
It's a serious charge.
And those people might be legitimately frightened to enter into the debates about the actions of Israel and criticisms if they are likely to be accused wrongly of being anti-Semitic.
I mean, possibly, but there is a lot of anti-Israel debate and activism that goes on where people don't seem cowed in any way. So I don't know how much that actually happens.
Well, the fact that 38 of the 40 accusations made in the study you cite were rejected suggests that false accusations were made or unfair accusations were being made about anti-Semitism.
Potentially.
In relation to the IRA definition having accepted the vagaries or limitations of it as a definition, you say that providing education and training globally to establish a common understanding of the use of the IRA definition would effectively cure the problems. Is that right?
I said it would help.
Okay.
I think it absolutely would help. I think, I mean, as we've discussed already, I think the more that people can accurately interpret and use the definition as it was originally drafted and intended for, the better. There are cases I'm aware of, and I don't know if this is included in any of those 40 in that report or not, where the IRA definition was actually used to exonerate people from complaints of anti-Semitism. So if the definition is used correctly, it can benefit everybody involved in the debate.
Given the controversies surrounding IRA that you've drawn attention to, can I suggest to you that arriving at a common understanding is likely to be challenging?
Well, I'm an optimist. I think, look, the Handbook for Practical Use of the Working Definition that I've cited is, I think, a really good development. It's a relatively recent development. But I think it's a really useful addition to assist institutions and other organisations in how to use the definition.
I want to take you to a simpler suggestion, one that is less likely, I suggest to you, to cause the confusion and ambiguity that you've identified is possible from IRA. At paragraph 2.1 of your report, when you were asked to identify what anti-Semitism is, you said, anti-Semitism is anti-Jewish prejudice, discrimination, or hostility. That's a good definition, isn't it?
Very limited. It's not really a practical working tool.
You're familiar with the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism as a tool? It's a tool to identify, confront, and raise awareness about anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
The definition used, can I suggest to you, is almost identical to yours. Anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or Jewish institutions as Jewish. I suggest to you that that's a good definition.
No, it's flawed in one very important respect, which is this idea that defining anti-Semitism as being against Jews as Jews has the flaw is that it leads people to think that only language that explicitly names Jews as the target can be counted as anti-Semitic. Now, I know in the body of the Jerusalem Declaration they try and undo that damage, but the framing of the anti-Semitism is discrimination, etc., against Jews as Jews is too limiting, and it encourages people to miss all the coded anti-Semitism, all the anti-Semitism that gets directed against Jews as anything other than explicitly Jews.
You refer to this alternative formulation by Brian Klug, using the term Jews as Jews, as flawed, because you say it's formulated on the basis that people sometimes don't directly express their hostility. And they need
very
to.
Often they don't. Yeah.
But Klug's point is not that the Jews part of the anti-Semitism formulation must be evident in direct terms, but rather that the attack on a person's Jewishness is an inherent part of anti-Semitism, whether it's directly stated or not.
Yes, so what he's trying to get at, I think, is to get around the problem of if a Jewish person is attacked but not because they're Jewish, or a Jewish institution. So someone throws a brick through the window of a synagogue, but it's not because it's a synagogue. They don't even know it's a synagogue. They just like throwing bricks through windows, right? It's that kind of thing. So I understand his intention, but I think the wording he ended up with is flawed because of this danger that I've described, that it leads people to think that that anti-Semitism has to be explicitly anti-Jewish in its language. And that's the practical way that it plays out.
I take it you've read a significant amount of Klug's work, academic work.
I have.
You're familiar with his thought experiment of Lucy, the bus driver, evicting Rabbi Cohen from the Hackney omnibus.
I am.
And what he says is that if Lucy evicts Rabbi Cohen because he's smoking, and smoking's against the rules, that's clearly not anti-Semitic. You'd agree with that?
Yep.
Whereas if Lucy evicts Rabbi Cohen because he's Jewish, but she says it's because he's smoking, then that is clearly anti-Semitic.
Yep.
So Klug's definition is directed at people's actual motivation rather than what the person says is their motivation.
Yeah, but motivation is not the whole picture. Because it's also about the language people use. As I've said, people use anti-Semitic language without realising it. And it's also about the impact of their actions. I mean, we measure discrimination through impact as well as through intention.
I'm going to ask that the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism come up on the screen, Your Honour. Those assisting you have kindly said that that is possible.
Yes, indeed.
Dr. Rich, I know you're no doubt very familiar with this, but hopefully that's... Are you able to see that?
I can, yes.
So it starts, of course, if the operator might scroll to the top of that document. The Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism is a tool to identify, confront and raise awareness about anti-Semitism as it manifests in countries around the world today. It includes a preamble, definition and a set of 15 guidelines that provide detailed guidance for those seeking to recognise anti-Semitism in order to craft responses. And then if we might scroll down to the definition, which is the one that I took you to, and then the guidelines underneath it. Dr. Rich, I'm obviously not going to read each of these to you, but I just want to point out the categories. In the general categories at A, 1 to 5, you would no doubt agree with all those general principles. Is that right?
Yeah.
Just for those listening, I'll just take an example. The first one, it's racist to essentialise or treat a character trait as inherent or to make sweeping negative generalisations about a given population. What is true of racism in general is true of anti-Semitism in particular, etc. There are 5 of them. And then under B, Israel and Palestine, examples that, on the face of it, are anti-Semitic. 6, applying the symbols, images and negative stereotypes of classic anti-Semitism to the State of Israel, and examples are given of that. Holding Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct or treating Jews simply because they are Jewish as agents of Israel. Clearly that's anti-Semitic and a good example. Do you agree?
Yeah.
And then requiring people because they are Jewish publicly to condemn Israel or Zionism, for example, at a political meeting. That's a good example of anti-Semitism. Do you agree? And Dr. Rich, assuming that, another example is assuming that non-Israeli Jews, simply because they are Jews, are necessarily more loyal to Israel than to their own countries. I think you draw on those similar examples of anti-Semitism in your report. And number 10, denying the rights of Jews in the State of Israel to exist and flourish collectively and individually as Jews in accordance with the principle of equality. That's a good example, a good, clear example of anti-Semitism.
No, I think that's a bad example when it's read in conjunction with example 11.
Example 11 under C is examples that are on the face of it not anti-Semitic. And further nuance is provided there in C, in brackets, whether or not one approves of the view or action. Those are examples that are on the face of it not anti-Semitic. And can I suggest to you that those guidelines give a clearer understanding to people about what is or isn't anti-Semitic, whether you agree or disagree?
No, I don't think they do. I don't think the Jerusalem Declaration is clearer than the IRA definition at all.
Do you accept that there is that reasonable minds differ on that issue?
Yes.
Your explanation of the IRA definition or guideline, whatever we call it, gives a lot of latitude to people to exercise their judgment in determining whether or not something is or isn't anti-Semitic. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
There are not always rational actors, perhaps that's a great understatement, in these debates about what is happening in the Middle East. There are highly emotive, passionate people debating the rights and wrongs of that conflict. Do you agree?
Yes.
And the extent of latitude and subjectivity that the IRA definition gives can create ambiguity that is unhelpful in guiding people to take care in that debate, I suggest to you.
No, I think it's the opposite. I think it's very helpful because the IRA definition was designed and intended as a tool for investigators, whether that's law enforcement, regulators, civil society bodies, whoever. And for exactly the reasons you say, because this is a very emotive debate, people have very strong feelings which are often very linked to their personal identity, I think it is only right that when a complaint is made and an investigator comes to that complaint, all these things are taken into account, into consideration in the context, rather than just branding someone an anti-Semite because they used a particular word or a particular phrase with no accommodation to the wider context. I think that, for all the reasons you say, actually, I think that's why the IRA definition works so well.
Do you see that letter C that I took you to earlier, Israel and Palestinian examples that are on the face of it not anti-Semitic, whether or not one approves of the view or action? The very first one, number 11, says supporting the Palestinian demand for justice and the full grant of their political, national, civil and human rights as encapsulated in international law is not anti-Semitic. That's an important message, isn't it?
So yes, in isolation, it's important and it's fine. My issue with it is when you read it together with point 10. Point 10 talks about the right of Jews in the state of Israel, and point 11 talks about Palestinian rights. But it uses very different language. It uses language that implies lesser rights for Jews, ironically, because it talks about the principle of equality. I would be much happier if it talks about the rights of Jews and the rights of Palestinians using exactly the same language rather than differentiated.
I took you earlier to references that you've made in signatories, 104 signatories from human rights and other civil society groups urging the United Nations to respect human rights in the fight against anti-Semitism, arguing against the IRA definition and in favour of other definitions, including the Jerusalem definition, that they argue are clearer and provide for less ambiguity. You accept that?
I accept they argue that, yes.
Ms. Dwyer?
Yes.
I don't want to interrupt your flow, but I am conscious of the time, particularly for Dr. Rich. Can I just suggest that you move quickly through?
I'm also conscious of the time. Commissioner, I've got about 5 minutes more.
Dr. Rich, can you bear with us a little longer? Thank you.
Yeah, that's fine, thank you.
You, in your report, Dr. Rich, draw attention to anti-Semitism expressed by the far left, the far right and extremist Muslims, and you alert us to the dangers of those extremist groups. The commonality in those dangers is there people at the extremes of those groups. Do you agree?
I mean, extremist politics is dangerous, and the more people who believe in those politics, the more dangerous they are.
There are many people to the right of politics, to the left of politics, and of course many Muslims who support the rights of Jewish people to flourish.
Yes.
And it's
Very much so.
It's important to recognise that, isn't it?
Yes.
At paragraph 6.1 of your report, you refer to the dangers of conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Israel or indeed anti-Semitism. At 6.28, you note that Jews can, of course, be anti-Zionist themselves for a number of legitimate reasons, and they're clearly not anti-Semitic in expressing those reasons.
That's correct.
And at paragraph 6.12, you refer to a study where 85% of self-declared Zionists agreed that, quote, there's no contradiction between being a committed Zionist and a critic of the Israeli government policy.
That's correct.
One needs to be careful then to distinguish anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Yes, as I write in my report, they're not always the same, but there are anti-Semitic forms of anti-Zionism that are very common. Let me put it that way.
But Jewishness and the nation of Israel are clearly distinct concepts, aren't they?
The nation of Israel or the state of Israel?
The state of Israel.
They are distinct concepts. They're very closely connected in Jewish life today, but they are distinct concepts.
Can I suggest to you that promoting the idea or suggesting that all Jewish people are inherently linked with Israel or that they inherently support the state of Israel collapses that distinction?
Well, so Jewish identity is inherently linked to the land of Israel, to the places. They're absolutely central to the existence of a Jewish people and Jewish religion and culture. But to assume from, and look, I've given the figures, I've given the polling figures about how majority Jewish opinion sits on this. But by definition, none of those figures are 100%. Right? So of course there are Jewish people who do not feel a connection to the state of Israel. They're just as Jewish.
And anybody that thinks otherwise is at risk of causing harm, aren't they?
I mean, the arguments within Jewish politics and Jewish communities can get very emotional and very heated, for sure.
And they can be harmful to the mental health of some people who are at the end of those slurs, can't they?
Well, I'm not an expert on mental health, but they're unpleasant, let me put it that way.
It might lead to people thinking it's valid to question a person's Jewishness or to call them slurs like self-hating because that person doesn't support the state of Israel or Zionism.
I mean, that's not a wording I would ever use or approve of. As you say, I think these debates should be conducted in respectful terms, but people do feel very strongly about it on both sides.
Final issue is this. You indicate at 5.52 of your report, Dr. Rich, and this is not controversial, that anti-Semitism should be seen as a form of racism of equal potency and danger to other forms of racism.
Equal potential, potency and danger.
And if it's not seen as a form of racism, then that undermines the efforts to tackle anti-Semitism within the broader anti-racist education or campaign, correct?
Yeah.
And the public needs to understand that, don't they?
I think it would be helpful if people recognised anti-Semitism as a form of racism, yes.
And that one important way to tackle anti-Semitism is within a broader anti-racist education campaign.
I think to the extent that anti-racist education and campaigns occur and lots of companies and organisations have anti-racist training, I think it's very important that that training includes anti-Semitism and reflects anti-Semitism as it actually is and how it manifests today.
It's important, isn't it, to tackle anti-Semitism in a way that doesn't undermine the fight against other forms of prejudice?
I think, that applies in all different directions between all different types of prejudice.
Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Dwyer. Dr Rich, if I can just test your forbearance this little bit further while I inquire if Mr Sheehan has any questions that he'd like to ask you.
Just a couple.
Yes.
Doctor, you were reminded of Dr Brian Cloug's Hackney omnibus thought experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Your answer in relation to that included an observation that actual motivation is not the whole picture, and that in the context of discrimination we measure it by impact, not just intention. Can I get you to explain briefly, because I know it's a big subject, explain briefly what you were alluding to there?
So, anti-Semitism, when we measure anti-Semitism, this is the case for all types of discrimination, people can act in discriminatory or prejudiced ways without malice, without consciously meaning to do so. People use anti-Semitic language without understanding it. Companies, governments adopt policies and practices that discriminate against people of one particular background without realizing it. So, for example, universities that hold exams on a Saturday when Orthodox Jews cannot sit those exams. There may be no intention to exclude Orthodox Jews from their exams, but the impact is obviously very detrimental, and it's an impact that only lands on Jews who observe the Sabbath. So that would be an example of a discriminatory action that would be anti-Semitic in its impact, but not in its intention.
Okay, thank you. Now, you also said, Doctor, in answer to some questions about the Jerusalem Declaration, that you didn't think it was clearer than the IRA, I'll call it the IRA exposition so that I avoid the word definition. In what way do you think it's the Jerusalem Declaration is no more clear than the IRA exposition?
Can I just say, I'm very happy for the IRA definition to be called a definition. My point is that the objection to it on that basis is a semantic objection. It's not a substantive one. On the Jerusalem Declaration, look, firstly, it's much, much longer, right? And without wanting to be disrespectful to anyone, and one of the authors of the Jerusalem Declaration was my former PhD supervisor, so I'm not being disrespectful in any way. The IRA definition was written by practitioners to be a practical tool. The Jerusalem Declaration was written by academics to set out their views, and they read differently in that way. When I look at the Jerusalem Declaration and I ask myself, could the safety officer at, the MCG, who's got a complaint of anti-Semitism from a fan at a cricket match, use the Jerusalem Declaration as a helpful practical tool? And I think that stadium safety officer would get about a third of the way through and give up. It's just not written for that practical purpose. So as an academic exercise, it may well be quite rewarding, but I don't think it's a practical tool at all.
Thank you. Now, in your report at various points and in the questioning by Ms Dwyer, you were asked about the possibility that the IRA definition, because of its fuzziness at the boundaries, might have a chilling effect on free speech. And you addressed that in your report, but I wondered whether you were aware of any evidence that it had a significant chilling effect on free speech.
Not that it's had a significant chilling effect, no. There are a couple of examples from British universities in 2017 that get brought up repeatedly. The fact that those are the ones that still get brought up tells me there hasn't been much since. And 2017 was not long after the definition had been brought in. It was the first time people were trying to engage with it and use it. I'm aware of other examples where Ofcom, the media regulator in the UK, for example, has used the IRA definition and used it to find people or broadcasters innocent of anti-Semitic complaints. So it's a tool that can actually equip people, can benefit people in that way. And of course, in all of this, the broader context is there are some types of free speech, namely anti-Semitic free speech, where it's not necessarily a bad thing to chill that kind of speech. The point is to try and draw the boundaries in a place that is fair for everybody. And I think the IRA definition is a good faith effort to draw those boundaries in a fair place.
Just one last topic. Doctor, you mentioned the protocols of the Elders of Zion in your work. In your evidence this morning, you mentioned that it had a considerable readership in the first half of last century, and that you explained that it had an afterlife in the form of the idea of Jews as the ultimate conspirators, if I can put it that way. Does it still continue to be published? Does it have an ongoing readership, this work?
So it's been translated into many different languages. I have copies published in Iran, Malaysia, Pakistan, United States, United Kingdom, France. I have a very strange book collection. It's now online, but what you tend to get is not many people today have read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion itself. But the idea the idea that there is a global Jewish or Zionist conspiracy is very, very common. It's very common. It's perpetuated especially online through the internet and social media. So the core idea is everywhere, even if the book itself isn't necessarily read by that many people now.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Commissioner.
Mr. Singh. Dr. Rich, thank you very much for agreeing to sit so late to give your evidence. It's much appreciated. That does now complete it, and you are excused.
Thank you very much.
Now, Mr. Lancaster, I understand there might be some formal matters that Council assisting intend to attend to. Would it... Yes. Yes, very well. I'll make it another 5-minute adjournment.
Commissioner, there are a number of documentary tenders that I and Ms Phillips will attend to now.
Yes.
The first arising out of the examination of Dr Rich is to tender the Jerusalem Declaration, which has the document ID RCD.0001.001.0187, and that.
Yes, that would be exhibit 1.131, or does that put us out of kilter with documents that might have been provisionally marked, Mr. Lancaster?
That would put us out of kilter. Could I
Yes.
suggest that it be 1-176, I think, is the next available.
I'm sorry?
1-176 is the next available exhibit.
Well, that'd be quite a bit out of kilter. All right. Exhibit 1.176.
The next category, Your Honour, Commissioner, is the documents relied on for the publication of the interim report in its complete form and in its confidential form.
Yes.
Could I explain the way we've dealt with that? There is a list assigning exhibit numbers to each of the documents that have been referred to in the interim report, and
Yes.
those documents appear in the footnotes, and all of them are proposed to be admitted into evidence, some of them available publicly as reflected in the public version of the report, but otherwise not available publicly. There are 3 schedules that the team has prepared. Schedule A is a list of documents produced by parties in response to a notice that are referred to in the footnotes of the public version of the interim report.
Yes.
I tender those documents, and they in due course will be available on the Commission website. That is accessible to the public.
Yes. Well, those documents will be received, and they bear sequentially the exhibit numbers IR1 to IR108.
Thank you.
And I note those are the documents that will be made public on the Commission's website.
Yes.
Yes.
Schedule B is comprised of documents that have been produced by parties in response to a notice. They are only referred to in the confidential version of the interim report, but I tender those documents. It's not presently proposed that there be any direction that they be published, of course.
Yes, very well. Well, those documents will be received as confidential exhibits, and they will bear the markings IR109 to IR374.
The third category set out in Schedule C are the documents that were otherwise publicly available and that the Royal Commission team itself has accessed and provided to you, Commissioner, and been referred to in the interim report.
Yes.
I tender those documents.
Those documents will be received as exhibits IR375 through to IR480, and again they will be made public. That's so, Mr. Lancaster?
That is so.
Yes.
There may be the need for some qualification of what I said about the documents in Schedule A. Some of them have been produced on a confidential basis in respect of particular aspects of the documents, and there's a procedure in place where parties with leave to appear have been asked to identify what, if any, limitations they propose on the public accessibility of the documents referred to in Schedule A. That process is ongoing. It should be resolved within the next few weeks, but at present I can't inform you, Commissioner, what we would propose in terms of public accessibility of the Schedule A documents without going through that process.
Well, that is noted. Yes.
Thank you. I think Ms Phillips can deal with the balance of the tenders.
Commissioner, the first matter relates to the statement of Gillian Siegel, who
Yes.
we heard from last Thursday. Annexure H to that statement was not tendered by Mr Lancaster when Ms Siegel
Yes.
gave her evidence, and I'd seek to tender that now as a confidential exhibit, the subject of a non-publication direction. It has doc ID stat.899.0034.0009_R.
Yes. That will be received then as Exhibit 1.131, and in relation to that, there is a non-publication direction in respect of the entire exhibit.
And Commissioner, the next matter relates to the statement of Gail Smith, who gave evidence before the
Yes.
Commission last Wednesday. I'd now seek to tender, as part of Exhibit 1-49, the annexures to Ms Smith's affidavit that was marked with that exhibit number, and they comprise annexures JCV-1 to JCV-8 inclusive, and they are within the existing doc ID, but with subpages _0011 to _0077.
Yes, well, those documents will be received. They form part of Exhibit 1.49 now.
Thank you, Commissioner. And the final matter relates to a bundle of documents that
Yes.
we propose to tender. They are listed in an index with the title Exhibit Bundle Nature and Prevalence of Antisemitism, which I understand has been made available, including to the
Yes.
parties with leave. The documents in that index contain information and data that has been received by the Royal Commission in connection with the nature and prevalence of anti-Semitism in Australia in various domains. We certainly don't suggest that the documents in the bundle are exhaustive of all of the information that the Royal Commission has received to date on those matters, but they provide a starting point to that inquiry, and a number of the documents have been referenced throughout the witness evidence that has been received this week, including from Professor Marcus
Yes.
and others.
Very well. The documents will be received as Exhibits 1.132 through to 1.175, and again, in due course they will be published. Is that the position?
Yes, I understand that's the case.
Yes. Very well, Ms Phillips. Does that complete the formal matters?
It does.
In that case, I will adjourn the Commission until 10 a.m. on Monday the 25th of May.